Quick PSA, my crock is holding my phone. The title of this article is Sweatshops Benefit Children, which is controversial and attention grabbing, and it's meant to engage the readers immediately with the topic at hand. And then the very first paragraph is all quoted material. The author did not write any of it. It's actually from two independent reporters that are given an anecdote from sweatshop workers in Thailand, and it's meant to garner sympathy for those who still work in sweatshops or those who depend on sweatshop wages to make a living or to support their families and themselves. And then as the anecdote concludes, the next paragraph is all facts, and the author uses BBC in order to build his credibility, because BBC is a very known news network that's been reliable in the past. And then as the second paragraph progresses, the last line introduces his line of reasoning.
So this section begins with the title. It reads, "Third world countries need the advantage of cheap labor," and the word advantage implies that it is actually helping and supporting in the growth of the third world countries, not just the Western industry. But this isn't supported in the rest of his paragraph. In this section, he mainly talks about how it is good for Western industry. The first line of reasoning is the first sentence. It says, "In truth, every prosperous country on the planet today went through an industrial period heavily reliant on sweatshop labor." And he supports this by stating the countries as evidence. This is effective, and it's good that he supported it, but it creates sort of an everyone's doing it mentality. It was an attempted use of ethos, but was unsuccessful. Then he goes on to glorify child labor by saying, "Road to modernity on the backs of child laborers," and vilifies his opponents by saying they're anti-globalization activists, and makes sure that choice isn't available. He appeals to his Western or American audience through this line, because he appeals to freedom and free will, which are a big deal, especially in the Western world, so that they will agree with him and support his points. Then he goes on to support his second line of reasoning, which was at least the choice was available, and doesn't really support this with any evidence. So on this side, he begins with his third line of reasoning, which is that Western companies today are wealthy enough to pay living wages to establish comfortable working conditions and protect third world environments. It's a good point, but he doesn't really support it with any evidence. He does provide a counter argument in the first two sentences and acknowledges the opposing view, which is good. He also states they may be right, gives a little bit of credit, but then quickly refutes it in the next few sentences. It is very forward and proves his point, but it is also dehumanizing, which devalues his argument. He takes the value out of the people and just approaches it as a country and political matter, without valuing the people and taking into consideration the pathos of the situation. He invalidates himself. Then his last line of reasoning is that cheap labor may be the only chit the third world has to lure much needed Western investment. And similarly, this dehumanizes the people and makes his argument much less effective. Although this claim is insensitive, he does provide evidence by explaining the financial risks of Western companies by starting these corporations.
So I'm going to be discussing how free trade beats sweatshops, and this is already just the section header, so we can write section header, and this is the basis for this whole little section right here. So the author begins by writing, "The best way to lessen the plight of sweatshop workers is more free trade, not less." So to break this down a little bit, plight is pretty much an unfortunate situation. We'll just write sit. So the best way to lessen the unfortunate situation of sweatshop workers is more free trade, not less. And free trade, if you're unfamiliar with that, is a policy that does not restrict exports or imports like internationally. So pretty much it's pro free trade. And then the author gives an example right here, which is to make himself more credible. So he sounds like he knows what he's talking about. So his example is, if workers make 75 cents per day in Factory A, the only plant in town, which this is important right here because it shows that this is the only place where these people can get income, the best thing that could happen to them would be for a second factory to open. Now, if a second factory opens, this causes competition between the two factories. So that would be the same factory to open up. If Factory B pays less than 75 cents, it won't attract any workers. If it offers exactly 75 cents, it might attract a few workers who couldn't get jobs at Factory A. And if it pays more than 75 cents, more than 75 cents, it might attract the best and brightest from Factory A. So with that being said, Factory A then must decide whether to up its wages or to look for new labor, which means more jobs. So pretty much what this is explaining is that people go where there's money. People go where there's money.
Hi, so I'm going to be annotating the Sweatshops Lead to Success section. So first, the author, Bradley Balco, transitions from the rest of the article to his concluding paragraph with recent history teams with examples of how sweatshop labor has helped poor economies lead to prosperity. This transition sentence that ends in an epilepsy leads to the idea of pathos and logos and ethos that'll be used in this entire section. He uses pathos at the end, he uses logos in the middle, and he uses ethos at the beginning. So let's start with the ethos. He uses the ethos when he credits both Christoph and Wu Dun as he paraphrases their writing using the ellipses and then paraphrasing the important parts that will help his argument. He also uses ethos when he credits the Swedish economist John Norberg and uses his statement. He uses pathos when he uses the word millions of sweatshop workers. Every 10 years by 2010, and that's all for this thing. By using these numbers, he adds more of a credibility towards the actual logic behind his argument. And lastly, he uses pathos when he says, but that's just it. A country must be able to afford, emphasis on the afford since it's italicized, to ban child labor before child labor is pulled out from underneath it. That supports his whole argument and concludes it all in one sentence by not necessarily being the thesis. It just proves his point that a country in poverty might need child labor, not necessarily to torture the kids, but so that way they can eat. He says that more at the beginning of the article.
The author doesn't provide a direct one-sentence thesis in this piece. Instead, it's more of a summarized or implied thesis that's proven throughout the article. So in the first section, he proves this through examples and uses the first section as more of an introduction without really proving his point. And then in the second, he starts to address some of his lines of reasoning. And and addresses some of the larger pieces of his argument, but in a more summarized fashion. Then in the third section, he uses one specific example that addresses specifically his economic line of reasoning. And then at the end, lists several pieces of evidence that support his argument without really expanding. So there is not a one-sentence thesis, but his argument is clear and is supported throughout the entire piece.
Looking at the article as a whole, the line of reasoning is consistent throughout the entire paper, but we noticed that although his title isn't meant to be taken literally, when he mentions children in the very first paragraph and then fails to really mention them at all throughout the rest of the article, makes it seem like he was trying to talk about the children, but then decided just to drop the subject completely without ever coming back.
This leads back to the part 1 for this project, question 3. As I evaluate the effectiveness of the evidence, there's plenty of evidence to look in just this one section. There's plenty more of ethos, pathos, logos in the other paragraphs and sections, and there's plenty other evidence used to prove his credibility and the effectiveness of his argument. So, thank you for watching.